Welcome to the fifth episode of Gender Trouble, the podcast where we dive deep into Judith Butler's seminal work, Gender Trouble, a radical rethinking of feminism, identity, and, well, the very meaning of gender. I'm your host, ready to wrestle with some truly mind-bending ideas.
And I'm here to explore how these complex ideas unpack the world around us.
So today we're doing something a bit different. We're actually leaping ahead, jumping right to the conclusion of Gender Trouble.
Yeah, specifically pages 181 to 190.
Exactly. This is where Butler really tries to pull together her, let's say, challenging arguments, especially that whole idea of performativity we've touched on before.
Right. And she's asking, okay, what does all this mean, for politics, for actually making change in the world?
We're going straight to the source material, working directly from the text of Gender Trouble.
And our mission, I guess, in this deep dive is to really try and grasp Butler's final thoughts on things like identity, agency, and what feminist politics could even look like if we stop seeing gender as this, fixed, solid thing.
Okay, let's jump in then. Butler kicks off this conclusion, page 181, with a question that feels, well, pretty fundamental for feminism.
And really for any identity-based politics, wouldn't you say?
Totally. Can feminism even function politically without a stable, kind of agreed-upon category of women as the group it represents?
It's a huge question because so much political action just assumes there's this unified we.
Right.
And Butler looks at that feminist we and suggests it's often what she calls a phantasmatic construction.
Phantasmatic construction.
Yeah.
Wow, so like a projection, a useful image maybe, but not solid.
Exactly. Not necessarily reflecting a single concrete reality.
So she's saying this idea of a unified women isn't quite real, or maybe just tenuous is a better word. Why tenuous?
Well, her argument is that in the very effort to create this seemingly unified identity of women, feminism has often, maybe inadvertently, ended up excluding or marginalizing people. Well, people whose experiences just don't fit a specific mold, right? It might rely on a definition that leaves out, say, women of color, or trans women, or women with disabilities. The list goes on. That supposed unity comes at the price of recognizing internal diversity.
Okay, and here's where Butler throws that curveball. Right after saying this we is unstable, she insists, and this is key, this isn't cause for despair.
Right, which seems totally counterintuitive, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Why isn't the crumbling of this foundational category a disaster for feminist politics?
Because she sees this instability, this lack of a solid foundation, as actually opening up possibilities, not shutting them down.
Okay, how?
When the idea of a fixed sort of natural category of women gets challenged, it doesn't just destabilize that one category, it shakes up the whole system that relies on these fixed genders.
Oh.
It opens up, she says, other configurations, not only of genders and bodies, but of politics itself. It lets us imagine new ways of being and maybe new ways of organizing politically, too.
That is. Yeah, that's a really radical shift from how we usually think about identity politics.
It really is.
Normally you think, first, I am this identity, right, like woman. Then, based on that identity, I figure out my political interests. I join a group that represents people like me.
The identity comes first.
Yeah, but Butler seems to be flipping that whole script.
Completely flipping it. On page 182, she puts forward this really challenging idea.
Yeah.
The doer, the person, the identity, isn't something that exists fully formed before the deed, the actions, the performances.
Wait, say that again?
The doer, the identity, is actually constituted, kind of built through those very deeds, those actions.
Okay, help me unpack that. So it's not like
Yeah.
I'm a woman and then I decide to do things society labels as womanly.
It's more like by doing those things, by performing in ways that get recognized as womanly, you are, in that process, being constituted as a woman by the social context.
Wow.
But she's really careful here. She distinguishes this from something like, say, existentialism, where you have this totally free self just choosing its essence.
Right, it's not just pure choice.
No. She calls it the discursively variable construction of each in and through the other. Identity and action construct each other.
Discursively variable. Okay, so think of it like identity and action are like dancing partners.
That's a great analogy, yeah. Neither one is fully formed before they start dancing, right? And the steps they can do, the actions, the identities they can perform are shaped by the music and the rules of the dance floor.
The rules of the dance floor being The discourse, the social norms.
Exactly. Those are the rule-governed discourses she mentions around page 184. These are the kind of social and linguistic rules that dictate how we can even show up as an intelligible I, how we can perform a gender that other people recognize.
And these rules obviously are deeply shaped by things like, well, gender hierarchy and compulsory heterosexuality, as she argues throughout the book.
Yes. The subject, the I, the identity, it's produced by these rules. It's kind of a consequence of trying to fit into the available boxes. But, and this is crucial, it's not completely determined by them.
Okay, why not? If the rules produce the identity, why isn't it totally locked down?
Because, as she puts it, I think it's also on 184, signification is not a founding act, but rather a regulated process of repetition.
Repetition, okay.
Identity isn't built in one single moment. It's built through the repeated attempts to perform according to these rules.
Yeah.
And repetition, well, repetition always introduces the possibility of difference, of variation. It's never perfect.
Okay, so repetition is the key here. This is where agency, like the possibility of acting differently, sneaks in.
Exactly.
On page 184, she says, agency is found within the possibility of a variation on that repetition.
Precisely. If identity is formed by repeatedly enacting these norms, then subversion acting against the grain isn't about somehow escaping those norms entirely. She seems to think that's impossible because they're the very ground we stand on.
Right. You can't just step outside.
No. Subversion is about performing them with a difference. The very rules that restrict us also, paradoxically, enable certain forms of expression. So repeating a norm in a slightly off way or an unexpected context that can open alternative domains of cultural intelligibility. It can challenge the rigid binary system.
So subversion happens within the system, within the practices of repetitive signifying, as she said.
Exactly. It's subtle, maybe, but powerful.
She gives this example, right? The injunction to be a given gender, that social command to perform masculinity or femininity correctly.
Yeah.
This command, she argues, again around page 184, inevitably produces necessary failures. Like nobody perfectly embodies the ideal man or the ideal woman.
There were always these incoherent configurations.
And these inevitable failures, they don't just miss the mark. She says they exceed and defy the injunction. They actually show the limits of the rule itself.
And it gets even more complex because we're never just responding to one rule at a time, are we?
No, definitely not.
We're constantly navigating overlapping, sometimes contradictory demands, like the classic example, be a good mother, and be a heterosexually desirable object, and be a productive worker.
Right. Those things can pull in very different directions.
Totally. And she says the coexistence or convergence of such discursive injunctions produces the possibility of a complex reconfiguration and redeployment. Just trying to manage these conflicting demands creates friction, it creates cracks, and maybe unexpected ways of putting things together.
It's like we have to take up the tools where they lie, is the phrase she uses.
Yeah, I like that phrase.
We aren't standing outside this messy system of demands, just choosing how to act. We're already in it. We're built by it.
And our ability to act, our agency, comes from using the tools that are available, the very language, the norms, the categories, even if we use them in ways they weren't intended, against the grain.
This connects back then to her big concept of the performative, which she references again here on page 185.
Absolutely. What we often think of as just the real or sexually factic.
Yeah.
Like the idea that biological sex is just a straightforward natural fact that exists before culture gets involved.
Yeah.
She argues these are actually, again, phantasmatic constructions. They're illusions of solidity, illusions of substance that bodies are kind of compelled to try and live up to.
But can never fully achieve.
Right. There's always a gap.
So the idea of a purely natural sex is also constructed, an effect of these repetitions.
It's constructed through repeated acts, repeated understandings, repeated ways of talking and seeing. And the gap, the rift, as she calls it, between this constructed ideal and the actual messy reality of bodies and lives that gets exposed when the real admits itself as phantasmatic.
When we realize that what felt like a solid foundation was actually built through repetition.
Yes. And that realization opens up space. It allows us to repeat those norms differently, maybe more critically.
And this is why the body itself becomes such a crucial site for Butler, isn't it? On page 185, she points out that bodily surfaces, how we look, how we appear, are presented as natural, but they are actually enacted. We perform their naturalness.
Exactly. And because they are enacted, because they're performed, they can also become, she says, the site of a dissonant and denaturalized performance that reveals the performative status of the natural itself.
Meaning our bodies, just by how we present them or move in the world, can perform gender in ways that show it up as a performance, not as something just natural or inevitable.
Precisely. It denaturalizes it, shows the strings, if you like.
Okay, so let's try and bring this all back to feminist politics then. Page 186 onwards. The big paradox seems to be that the very identity categories feminism has traditionally relied on,
Like women.
yeah, like women, might actually end up limiting the very possibilities feminism wants to open up. They limit and constrain in advance, she says.
It's a tough pill to swallow, maybe, for activist movements.
Yeah.
Yeah. The rules and repetitions that make categories like sex and gender seem so fixed and natural are actually, in her view, generative political structures. They produce reality. They don't just describe it.
And the really wild part, the twist, is that understanding identity as this effect, as something built by these structures, paradoxically, that understanding increases the potential for agency.
Right. It seems backwards, but she argues that potential for agency is insidiously foreclosed by positions that take identity categories as foundational and fixed. If you think the category is solid and natural, where's the room to change it?
So agency isn't found outside of these structures, outside of construction.
No, construction isn't the opposite of agency. Construction is the necessary scene of agency. It's the stage, the context, the very ground on which any kind of political action or intervention can even be made.
So the critical task for feminism then, according to Butler here, it isn't trying to find some pure, authentic, pre-social position outside of all constructed identities. She actually calls that an imperialist conceit on page 187.
Yeah, that's a strong phrase. It suggests this idea of standing outside is itself a kind of privileged position, claiming a universal view that ignores its own construction.
So if we can't stand outside, what's the task?
The task is to find strategies of subversive repetition enabled by those constructions. It means working within the very practices of repetition, the performances, the citations of norms that create identity in the first place,
Okay.
and finding ways to contest them from the inside, to repeat them differently.
You find the political action, she says right there in 187, in the very signifying practices that establish, regulate, and deregulate identity. So it's not just about representing an existing group called women, it's about intervening in the very processes that create who gets to count as a recognizable person or recognizable identity in the first place.
It's a really radical reimagining of where power operates, what identity is, and where the sites for political change actually are. It's not just in the halls of government. It's in everyday life, in language, in performance.
Wow. Okay, let's take a breath and try to pull this together. Our deep dive into these pages of Butler's conclusion, it reveals this really powerful, if challenging, argument.
Yeah.
Identity isn't some solid thing you possess before you get political. It's something that's shaped and constantly reshaped through the performances and repetitions that social norms kind of compel us into.
Right. And the possibility for agency, for making change, it isn't about escaping those constraints, which might be impossible anyway.
Instead,
It's about finding ways, maybe small ways, maybe big ways, to introduce variation or disruption into those very repetitions, working from within the system.
it really challenges us then to look at the everyday ways gender is enacted, how we talk, how we walk, how we dress, how we interact.
Not just as compliance or following the rules.
But potentially as a site of political struggle, of
Yeah.
transformation.
Exactly. Even in the repetition, there's possibility.
So thinking about your own journey through these ideas, how might this concept of identity as an effect and agency as variation within repetition, how might that shift how you think about who you are or how society works or even where and how change actually happens?
Yeah, if identity isn't fixed, but is something you're constantly doing, constantly performing, what does that mean for the story you tell yourself about yourself?
And maybe consider this thought, drawn from Butler's work, for yourself. If the rules and repetitions that shape our identities also, paradoxically, contain the seeds for variation and subversion, what everyday performances or signifying practices, those little acts, those ways of speaking in your own life or maybe in your community, might actually be sites for unexpected agency, unexpected change.
How could simply repeating the norms, but repeating them differently, become a political act? Not by trying to smash the system from the outside, but by subtly shifting it, messing with it from within.
That's definitely some powerful stuff to think about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.